So what happens when there's no oxygen left? As living organisms, our cells need a chemical called ATP. ATP is the gasoline that our cells use to run. And that's why we have photosynthesis. Autotrophs do photosynthesis in order to make sugar. Cells, all cells, then take that sugar and use it to make a chemical called ATP. Just like your car needs gasoline in order to run, our cells need adenosine triphosphate, ATP, in order to run. And we make ATP through a process called respiration. Now, think of it this way. Think about if you have a bar of chocolate and you've got to trade that bar of chocolate for gasoline in order to get home. Well, we are oxygen-breathing creatures. Most creatures use oxygen. So they can do a process called cellular respiration. And cellular respiration is a complex procedure in which our bodies, our cells, take sugar and oxygen and use it to make carbon dioxide, water, and 38 molecules of ATP. That's like having one Hershey's bar and trading it for 38 gallons of gas. However, some creatures are very primitive. They are archaea creatures. They've been around for years, and they find they don't mind not using oxygen. Or you're working out, and even though you're breathing really hard, your muscles are working so fast, they're using up the gasoline before you can make more. So nature has a process called fermentation. Fermentation is a type of respiration. It's what we call anaerobic respiration, meaning it will convert sugar into ATP, but it does not use oxygen in the process. Now, most creatures in nature do not do this because it's not very efficient. Most things tend to do what we call cellular respiration, and because they get 36 to 38 molecules of ATP. Again, that's like trading one Hershey's candy bar for 38 gallons of gas. Fermentation only gives that creature a net of 2 to 4 molecules of ATP. They're still getting gasoline, but they're not getting the bang for their buck. So we have to do what's called fermentation. Fermentation is anaerobic, which means oxygen is not required. Now, as humans, we breathe in oxygen all the time. So most of the time, our bodies do cellular respiration. But have you ever held something in your arms for a long period of time and your arms started to ache? Or have you ever been running and you get that pain in your side? Well, that's a sign that your body had to do fermentation. Even though you're breathing, you can't get oxygen to your muscle cells fast enough. And they have to rely on fermentation. So oxygen is not required. Creatures like yeast can do fermentation. Yes, they live in our world, they have oxygen, they just choose not to use it. So fermentation does occur in nature. Just as humans, it's not something we do that often. Now, in fermentation, you are actually still going to take sugar and you're going to break it down into ATP and chemicals. Remember, cellular respiration takes sugar and uses oxygen, but it ends up making ATP, water, and carbon dioxide. Fermentation is named according to what byproducts you make. And the type that you do depends on what type of organism you are. We have what's called alcoholic fermentation, and we have what's called lactic acid fermentation. Now, alcoholic fermentation will take sugar, and in the process will make carbon dioxide, ATP, and alcohol. Lactic acid will take sugar, and in the process make carbon dioxide, ATP, and a substance called lactic acid. So we have fermentation, which takes place in our cytoplasm. And no matter what, glycolysis will be the first step. Doesn't matter if you're breathing oxygen, using oxygen, or you're not. Glyco means sugar, lysis means to break. So as soon as sugar gets inside of our cells start to break it down. And it breaks it down into pyruvate and 2 molecules of ATP. Now, as you can see right here, pyruvate is also called pyruvate acid. This is an acid. We don't really want acid sitting around inside of our cells. So as soon as pyruvate or pyruvic acid is made, the cell has to break it down in order to get rid of it. Now, in the case of aerobic respiration or cellular respiration, we take that pyruvic acid and we send it to the mitochondria. And it goes through the Krebs cycle, and it goes through the electron transport chain. In the case of fermentation, that pyruvic acid stays in the cytoplasm, and the cytoplasm has to then find a way to break it down. So no matter what, glucose happens first. Glycolysis happens first. Glycolysis will take the glucose and break it down. And in the process, we get pyruvic acid and 2 molecules of ATP. So if oxygen is available, that pyruvic acid will then move into the aerobic respiration phase. But at this point in time, either oxygen is not available or our cells can't get oxygen fast enough. It's going to move into fermentation. In the case of alcoholic fermentation, this occurs in things such as yeast and bacteria. And, well, it makes what it says. In alcoholic fermentation, these creatures take sugar and they break it down into carbon dioxide, 4 molecules of ATP, and alcohol. Alcohol is a waste product. So basically, you can kind of think of alcohol as yeast pee. Now, in this case, you have all, probably seen bread being made and how bread rises, or if you cut in the bread, it has all these little holes in it. Well, we mix yeast into the bread dough. Well, what the yeast do is the yeast eat the sugar in the bread. And as the yeast do fermentation, they give off carbon dioxide. That's what causes the dough to rise and puts all the little holes in our bread. They also give off alcohol as a waste product. Like I said, it's kind of like yeast pee. But the alcohol in the baking process burns off. This is also how alcoholic beverages are made, such as wine. Wine is made from grapes. Grapes have a lot of sugar in them. So they will mix yeast in with, or whatever they're using, they'll mix it with the grape juice, and the yeast will start to eat the sugar and secrete the alcohol. So in alcoholic fermentation, we have glycolysis. And glycolysis has taken that sugar and broken it down into 2 molecules of ATP and this thing called pyruvate. Then, in the case of alcohol fermentation, it will take the pyruvate and turn it into alcohol, carbon dioxide, and more ATP. So in the end, I'll get 2 molecules of ATP from glycolysis and 2 molecules of ATP from fermentation. So alcohol fermentation only gives me 4 molecules of ATP. Cellular respiration gives me 36 to 38 molecules of ATP. So you can see why nature prefers to do cellular respiration. You get more for your money. And like I mentioned, we can use alcoholic fermentation in the making of alcoholic beverages and bread. Now, in animals, we have the ability to do what's called lactic acid fermentation. This occurs in our muscle cells. This is when you feel the burn. Okay. Well, in lactic acid fermentation, our muscles are working so hard that we can't get oxygen to them fast enough, but they need that gasoline to keep running. So they'll move into what's called lactic acid fermentation. It'll take that pyruvate and break it down into carbon dioxide, lactic acid, and ATP. Well, an acid is building up in our cells, and that acid will start to trigger nerve cells, and pain is your body's way of telling you to stop doing something. So when you've been running for long periods of time, you get a lot of lactic acid built up in your muscles. Well, our bodies send that lactic acid to our liver, and most of our liver is on our right side. That's why you get that pain in your right side. You're feeling that lactic acid buildup. Or I might ask you to hold your hand up for as long as you can. Well, eventually your arm's going to start to hurt. It's going to start to burn. That's due to the lactic acid that you're making. Even though you're breathing in oxygen, it doesn't mean the oxygen can get to that muscle fast enough. So they'll have to do lactic acid fermentation. So in this case, after lactic acid, or after glycolysis, we're still going to have pyruvate, but this time we're going to have lactic acid. We're also going to make carbon dioxide, and we're also going to make 2 molecules of ATP. So we get 2 molecules of ATP in glycolysis. We get 2 molecules of ATP in lactic acid fermentation. So again, a net of 4 molecules of ATP. And like I mentioned, this is what causes the muscle burn. Now, I don't know who thought of this But somebody figured out there's a way to use lactic acid fermentation to produce food particles, food products. This is how pickles are made. Pickles are made from cucumbers. You put it through a chemical reaction and lactic acid is made in the process. This is why pickles have that sour taste to them. Same thing with sauerkraut. Sauerkraut is made from cabbage. Well, you put it through a chemical, you add different ingredients to it, you cause it to make lactic acid. That's what gives it its sour taste. And the same thing with yogurt. Greek yogurt has a very sour taste to it. Greek yogurt has a lot of lactic acid in it. So again, with fermentation, both types of fermentation result in only ATP being created during glycolysis. And so you're going to get 2 molecules of ATP during glycolysis, and then you'll get 2 more molecules of ATP during fermentation. And it is much less efficient than aerobic, which can create 32 in addition to what's in glycolysis. So for a net of 36 to 38 molecules of ATP.